Hello, thank you. So today we are here to present our progress on our final project paper from the course Media Histories concerning the topic of Thailand in 1992 Black May incident. So media usage in this event was particularly influential. It became known as the mobile phones mob due to the middle class usage of phones to organize the protest. Yet the effects of television, radio, and newspapers cannot be ignored as a crucial part of conducting and receiving news regarding this event. So we will briefly explain the details of the event as well as the political and socio-economic context in the next part. So firstly, the Black May incident occurred 1 year after 1991 coup by military leaders who overturned the elected civilian government due to alleged corruptions. So General Sujinda Krapayun, the leader of 1991 military coup, became the prime minister, leading to a series of public protests by largely students and middle-class Bangkok citizens. So during late 1991 and early 1992, pro-democracy groups led by Jamrong Siemrang, the former governor of Bangkok, had begun their protest, with the first major protest taking place on 20th of April 1992. And Black May refers to the major protest which took place during the 17th to 20th of May in Bangkok, where the government responded against protesters with violence, which sending soldiers and police in an attempt to disperse the protest. And this led to numerous numbers of deaths, injuries, and missing persons. The confrontations between the two sides only ended after the leaders ordered with King Rama IX and Sujinda agreed to resign eventually. And as for the political context during this time, people were largely divided and could feel the tension rising in the protest by Jamlong. And basically, it was the time of tensions which could erupt at any moment. Yet, life continued on as the economy was peaking and developments were happening rapidly. And if we look back a decade before Black May, Thailand was under multiple authoritarian governments since 1975. After Samosat massacre, which justified military control of the country's political systems. However, the most notable regime was the General Prem Tinasulanont era, which was in control of the government for almost 10 years. And nevertheless, the era was considered the era of infrastructure development, which will be discussed on the next slides. The authoritative governments also censor a lot of media because they believe that giving too much freedom to the press will destabilize the government. However, after the Prem's era, an election was held, which resulted in transition from military to civilian government, which led by Chacha Chunhawan. However, during his time, the coup happened, which resulted in the Black May event.
Socioeconomically, Thailand was at its economic peak in the 1980s. More people began to become educated, leading to a rise in people working skilled jobs. Thailand began to develop major infrastructure projects such as roads and electrical lines during this period, though a side effect of this was increased pollution. Thus, we can assume that mass communication technology was drastically improved during this time as well, with television and radio becoming accessible to many households. Urbanization occurred at a rapid rate in Bangkok, further increasing the economic gap between Bangkok and other parts of the country. During this time, Thailand had a sizable middle class, with its economy being fueled by cheap labor and manufacturing jobs, as well as construction jobs. The era also coincides with the arrival of mobile phones into Thailand, which the high and some middle classes can access. People in rural areas, however, still relied on radio and television to receive the news, with the radio largely being controlled by the state, hence also leading to censorship, which caused many civilians distrust of the media. This is the result of unequal economic development of Thailand, that the countryside was neglected and most developments were only in Bangkok. This sizable number of middle class citizens and the educated would contribute heavily to the organization of the protests. Culturally, Thailand was beginning to become more and more globalized, with TV channels like Channel 5 and MTV exposing Thai people to international music, and Thai music videos becoming an essential part of the culture. The 1980s and the early 1990s were essentially a time of economic boom, yet political division and tension remained in the city of Bangkok, and citizens could not predict when the tensions would erupt and cause the events of Black May. We will briefly discuss the theories which we plan to use. Firstly, McLuhan's idea of medium as the message will allow us to establish a basis for how the nature of the media used during the time of Black May will affect how each participant reacted and still think about the protests today. This is contrasted with the idea of the linear model of communication. We then highlight the concept of the audio-visual language, oral culture, written culture, as well as the second orality, which impacted their thoughts depending on which form of media they used. Lastly, we will discuss globalization and deterioration within the context of Black May and its socio-economic context, as well as with the respondents of our participants. Moving on to how we conducted the interviews, we interviewed each participant with a semi-structured face-to-face interview, each lasting roughly 30 minutes. Interviews were recorded and transcribed from English to Thai to English, individually by each member of our group. Then we compared each interview by making a table of our answers and analyzed our findings.
So, questions were divided into categories, including introductory questions such as what they knew briefly about the events of the Black May. Context, what they were doing at the time, aftermath of the protests, and media usage. Participants range from ages of around 50 to 70 years old, coming from a mixture of provinces. However, they were all present in Bangkok when the events of Black May occurred. Details of the participants can be seen here in the slide. As you can see, there is a mixture of ages, as well as genders, jobs, and backgrounds. We can divide our participants into two groups. One group participated in the event directly, and another did not participate but watched the event. The classification can be interesting because they may use media differently. Furthermore, there are participants who were students at the time and those who work on other jobs. It can be seen in their responses too, that some were more knowledgeable about the subject of Black May, while others were not. This variety is what will provide us with a variety of detailed and interesting answers. So, participant 1 utilized television, radio, and newspaper. Participant 2 used mostly the radio and word of mouth. Participant 3 used word of mouth as well as the newspaper. And participant 4 used TV and radio as well as pagers. Participant 5 used TV and radios and word of mouth. And participant 6 used newspaper, TV, and radio. One of the main pieces of information we received from the interviews came in the idea that the government would always censor mass media, including the television and radio. All the participants mentioned in one form or another that they could not trust mass media due to the censorship by the government. Participants 2 and 3 each expressed how there was only one-way communication, aside from phones, which many lower-class people did not have access to, and the media at that time was the only source of information, so they did not really have a choice but to listen to the media. Participant 3 states the media can shape our perception because it's the only source. Participant 2 says, we can use social media to show our opinions, but back then people could not share their opinions aside from protesting. This highlights the linear model of communication present within Western liberal tradition. This binary between medium and message and the sender playing the active role, whilst the receiver plays a passive role is an idea which is, however, largely outdated, with Marshall McLuhan's notion of the medium as the message replacing this. Furthermore, this highlights the idea of society as a mass media society, where media were so crucial to shaping public opinion and national consciousness, with TV, radio, and newspaper at the forefront of this period of time. Moreover, this largely reflects the economic development during this time, when people become rich enough to purchase televisions and radio.
In our interview data, unlike the linear model of communication, further suggests that the medium is indeed the message, as interviewees were influenced by which forms of the media they used. Participants 2 and 5, who both received information by mouth to mouth, both expressed extreme distrust of the media during that time, explaining that they place a higher trust in the media created by independent people, such as newspapers or word of mouth. Participant 5 states that I couldn't fully believe in the government. I adapted to the situation during the time by listening to both my coworkers and the media. However, participant 1, who was a student at the time of the incident, read the newspaper, mentioning Mandisho newspaper in particular, and expressed that, unlike now, news at the time was universal in telling the truth, which is why it was more reliable than word of mouth. Participant 4, who was also the student at the time, also expressed that the viewpoint of newspapers like Mandisho and Manager were strongly critical critical of the government and published columns condemning its action. They became one of the few channels presenting alternative viewpoints, unlike radio and television, which were silenced. It can be seen that participants who were students largely trusted the newspaper over word of mouth or radio and television. This reflects the middle class, educated perspective, who during the time used newspapers and pagers to communicate as they were independent from government media. Hence, people believed that the media did shape the message, albeit in the way that the medium was the only way they could receive a message that they believed was uncensored. Interestingly, older participants who were not students tended to mention national unity as Thai individuals, with participants 2 and 3 used the word we to describe the nation, while participant 6 mentions the hopes of the people throughout the country. This may be because they were all exposed to newspapers or radio, either at their age or during the Black May protest, which builds its sense of national identity. In the next slides, we found one of the most interesting responses that came from participant 6, who stated that the image that everyone remembers shown on television and in newspapers was of General Suchinda and Major General Jamlong dressed in white uniforms, kneeling and bowing before the king. This highlights the aspect of audio-visual compared to oral culture and its impact towards people during the time of Black May. While the radio could only deliver sounds, the television and newspaper could deliver a visually powerful message, which Thai people could remember: the grace and power of the king, as well as the end to the turbulent conflict. While not exactly written culture, this highlights how their image can be critically examined by Thai people compared to simply hearing an announcement of the end to the conflict. Arguably, the visual aid of the king and the two opposing sides kneeling before the king emphasized the power of monarchy more powerfully than any audio message ever could.
On the topic of oral culture, participant 2 stated, newspapers are more reliable than TV and radio because on the radio you can only hear the sound. This likely references the nature of oral culture, as only the sound can be heard. There is no visual aid to provide evidence that the event actually happened. The idea that the newspapers are more reliable may be due to their written aspect, which allows for a more analytical approach to analyzing the event, as well as empowerment of individual interpretation. However, this may also be a result of, as participant 3 and 4 mentioned, the censorship on radio and television as opposed to the newspapers which were run by protesters or locals. Furthermore, participants 6, 3, and 4 mentioned the importance of mobile phones, calling the protest a mobile phone mob. This, as well as previous statements by participants 6 and 2, are largely reminiscent of the idea of a secondary orality as proposed by Walter Ong. Secondary orality generates a strong group sense, but generates a group sense that is immeasurably larger than those of primary oral culture, McLuhan's Global Village. Within secondary orality, Ong argues that we become group-minded by choice, not merely because it was the only choice like in regular orality. Moreover, secondary orality promotes a sense of spontaneity as through analytic reflection, we have decided that spontaneity is a good thing. All participants reflected on the spontaneity which is currently possible today through social media, highlighting how secondary orality is much more visualized today than within the past, where most communication was one way.
While McLuhan's Global Village has not been fully realized during the time of Black May protests, arguably, globalization was occurring at a rapid rate in Thailand during that time. There was music from other countries that began to permeate into the country, and much of a rural Thailand began to have access to radio and TV, participant 4 stated. At that time, print media was still very popular, but in rural areas, people relied heavily on radio and TV. When the government kept presenting false or one-sided information, people outside Bangkok started getting curious. Protests also happened in other provinces, especially in big cities with universities like Chiang Mai, Khon Kaen, and even in the south. The political movement spread across the country. From a cultural perspective, globalization highlights how information is becoming less determined by their social and geographical location. Hence, the location from the protests were much less determined by the location in Bangkok, and this ideology began to spread throughout the country. The cultural experience of people during that time were no longer confined to geographical location of which they live, building a sense of national identity within the country through widespread communication of ideas, whilst also de-emphasizing physical closeness in sense. The early 1990s was the beginning of Thailand's globalization and deteriorization. Deteriorization is the idea that culture is being increasingly lifted out of its confinement to particular physical locations and territories. Within the context of Black May protests, as participant 4 stated, people within other areas of Thailand also received the news of what happened in Black May and began organizing their own protests, removing the political idea of resistance from a singular physical space of Bangkok. To conclude, for now, we have found commonalities between each participant and tried to link them into socio-economic contexts and political contexts within the time, as well as theories studied in class. Their response were rather interesting in that they all expressed a sense of distrust in media regardless of which media they use. We have analyzed how some of the response align more closely with oral culture, the importance of visual media, and as well as the idea of secondarity, which many participants mentioned through the ideas of phones spontaneity. Thank you.